admired. But in doing research on him, I discovered some things about him that a little bit shocked me and lowered him a little bit in my esteem. Though his early work, oh, we're in totally the wrong place here, sorry. I'm talking about Gustabe Courbet, who is a very important figure. He's really, in the 19th century, he was for a long time the leading exponent of realism, which kind of began to replace romanticism. Now, a lot of stuff was going on at the same time. Romanticism rises in response to neoclassicism. And as far as the avant-garde artists are concerned, is a step forward. But neoclassicism continued throughout most of the 19th century and remained one of the dominant forms. But among the avant-garde artists, romanticism was replaced by realism. And we saw two of the great exponents last week, Millet and Daumier. But neither of them had the stature in French society, and in fact, beyond France, that Gustave Courbet managed to achieve. But he's a problematic character for a number of reasons. He's like Millet. He's from a farming family, though unlike Millet, his family was very prosperous. His father had so much property that he was allowed to vote, and you had to have a lot of property in those days to be allowed to vote. He was also apparently really spoiled. He was a real problem child. He was given the opportunity of a great education. I mean, Millet had to absolutely struggle to learn anything while he was working from dawn till dusk. Courbet was sent to extremely good schools and wouldn't study at all, and finally left without any degrees, threatening his parents that he was going to run away from home if they didn't let him out of the schools. And finally, the family finances his going to Paris to become a painter. And he works with he takes classes for a while in a studio, abandons that and goes to the Louvre. Like a lot of the avant-garde painters, he goes to the Louvre and starts copying painters that he likes. And he's in Paris for about 7 years, just going back and forth, doing actually very traditional stuff initially. And then he starts to make a breakthrough. But it takes him a little while. At first, he tries to define himself with a number of self-portraits, which are very interesting. Robert, you'd probably be interested in self-portraits.
Well, get over here. I'll start painting my dog.
Well, yeah, right. Well, but Courbet's self-portraits are interesting because they're the opposite of Rembrandt's. They don't tell us anything about Courbet. They tell us about what he would like us to think of him. There, he's posing. He's a poser, and he's a very spoiled, narcissistic, and very boastful person, actually.
That's telling us something about him.
Yeah. Now this one, you can see the influence here of Caravaggio, and he's exploring himself. He's exploring what he can do with his face. He's exploring different styles. Initially, his paintings were very literary influenced, but at a point he abandons this. He goes back to, he returns regularly to his home in Ornans. Now, Ornans is a provincial city, midway between south and north on the very eastern border of France. Is not a very long walk. Well, it's a major hike, but you can go from there right into Switzerland, to Zurich from there, which he eventually was constrained to do. But he drew immense inspiration from his family and from his town, where he was indulged and celebrated by everyone, and he could get anyone to pose for him. He practiced on his, this is one of his sisters. A very nice painting, I think. And it gives a sense of how close he was with his family. This painting, by the way, the portrait with a dog was accepted at the salon. So he began to feel more confident. He does this painting because he decides to define himself in terms of what he is. Someone from the provinces, from a farming family. And he decides to paint this, very much like Millet, except whereas Millet is painting the struggle and the pain and the suffering of the poor peasant, Courbet is celebrating rural life from the point of view of actually a very prosperous farming family. But this painting, dinner in Ornans, with his father falling asleep at the table and some friends around the table, was a big success at the salon. And it just happened that it was received success right after the revolution of 1848, when for a short while the rules around the academy were made more liberal, and it was agreed that any artist who was accepted and got a gold medal could submit without going through the jury in succeeding years. By the way, to me, it's reminiscent of some of Cézanne's paintings and Caravaggio. It's quite a good painting. It has a real rural flavor to it. Now he's beginning to really feel full of himself. So he embarks on some incredibly ambitious paintings, which are some of the finest work he did, and some of the most challenging and controversial. This burial in Ornans is 10 feet by 20 feet. This was a real burial. The general theory is that it was actually the burial of his grandfather, who was his hero. His grandfather was one of the original fighters in the French Revolution. And Courbet admired him. But everyone who's in this painting was at this burial, and they all posed for him. You can see, obviously the town loved him to be willing to do something like that. They didn't all pose at once, obviously, but so now this created a big furor in Paris, because this is the scale of a historical painting, so it should be a moment of real historical significance. But he's just talking about a family burial. And what he's saying is, the only history that any painter can paint, really and truly, is the history of his own place and time. And this was his big, the main thing he had to say, and the main thing he asserted with his work that was very influential. He also one day passed a couple of stone breakers and realized that here were some of the people, very poor people, doing some of the least remunerative work in the world, breaking stones. So he immediately hired them, and he did this painting, which also was not well received. This painting was destroyed in the bombing of Dresden, by the way, so it doesn't exist anymore. This is farmers coming home, or peasants coming home from the market, but these are actually quite prosperous peasants. This is his father and other people that he knew. And it was also not well received. One of the critics said, well, this painting will make you really glad that you live in Paris with nice, clean, well-paved streets. The other thing that offended the people in the salon was that they were used to colorful, sentimental celebrations of peasants. They weren't interested in, they didn't like something as gritty as this, with all these animals in it, and a pig being led by, you know, going on a rope. I mean, what is this? You know, so none of these paintings sold, though they ended up eventually being given to the state, and they're now owned by the state. But they gave him notoriety. This also, which I think he thought would be well received, it's his three sisters out on a walk, not far from town, giving alms to a cowherd. But the Parisians didn't like it at all. I think they thought that these ladies were not very fashionably dressed. And they didn't like the presence of the cows and the little cowgirl. So he continued to, this one though was brought by a friend of his, and I think it's a wonderful painting. Do you have something to say there, Wendy? Oh.
Oh, I just, no, I mean, I love it's almost like velvet, the grass. It's so
Yes.
lush and beautiful.
Well, if you look closely, and you can see the palette knife everywhere. Much of the time, he began with a black canvas, which unfortunately he used bitumen. It was a popular dark color in those days. Bitumen bleeds. So a lot of his paintings have gone super dark. I mean, to the point of extinction, actually. This one didn't. And then he would work with the palette knife directly on, laying the paint on that black surface. Now we see him, you know, in this painting, it's a manifesto. This is one of his patrons in the green jacket, fashionable, looking like he just came off the streets of Paris. He obviously didn't hike very far. He probably got out of this carriage here. He's with his dog, he's with his servant. You can see, obviously a servant, because he's taking a very subservient role in the painting. But who is the person who has the most presence in this painting? Courbet is known as Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet.
Mm.
And to me, it's a little bit of a put down of his collector, actually, because he's making himself out to be such an important figure. Back, obviously, from a day painting in the countryside. And he's asserting here that the painter is as important as the patron, which, you know, is a legitimate assertion, but there's a certain kind of arrogance beginning to enter his personality, unfortunately. I think it's very sad because he's a very capable painter. But here he is. Now, I hope I can find the title of this painting. It's got a very long title. And it's, well, in essence, it's a celebration of 7 years of painting and his moral development. Okay, it's very pompous. And it's a huge painting, huge. And on the left side are the people who are basically his enemies, who work against him, including Napoleon III. He puts him right in the painting. On the right side are people he considered his allies and friends, including Baudelaire. Now, what's interesting about that is Baudelaire, though he admired some of his early paintings, did not really consider himself a friend, and later became a real critic of Courbet, at least privately. And what is going on here? I've read writers who said that even Courbet didn't really know what he was saying in this painting, though it's a very eye-catching painting, and a lot of painters of the period were extremely impressed by it. But it was the last of his really ambitious undertakings, and already he's abandoned he's beginning to abandon the rural subjects, not completely, but as the mainstay of his work for the social life of Paris. He was an incredibly heavy drinker and carouser and womanizer, though he generally preferred prostitutes. This is his sister's, and I think this is a lovely painting. And yeah, I've always loved this painting. This is his illegitimate son who died quite young, and two of his sisters. But if he continued in this vein, but he moves on to work which continues to offend the critics, but it becomes quite saleable. The two young ladies on the edge of the Seine. Well, these young ladies are actually prostitutes, which the Parisians knew. This one is in her, what they considered undergarments. There's a man's hat in the boat. So the gentleman is going to return. It's a beautiful painting, but he's shifting his attention, and he's really moving towards, he's looking for ways to make his work marketable at the same time. What he actually said to a friend is, in one case, I'm sending in a painting which is going to create a real stir, but that will increase my marketability. So he's one of the first painters who is actually painting to create some sort of scandal in the hopes of raising his visibility in the marketplace. This is a fairly new phenomenon. But his painting, some of his paintings start to get very slapdash, because he's now famous enough that he can sell almost anything he does. And a painting like that, anything to do with hunting or animals, he could always sell. So he made it a point when he put paintings in the salon, which were going to cause trouble, to have paintings like this, which has some very good painting, but then some real slapdash painting that I don't think works very well.
Looks like Bob Ross.
Yeah, right. And this is a real puff piece here. Look at this. You see he's beginning to cater to taste. Even now, this is a beautiful painting, but it doesn't have any of the gritty earthiness of the earlier work. He's looking for ways to please his market now. Mm-hmm. But a lovely painting. Mm-hmm. Okay, around this time, he meets an important, well, he's more and more aware of the revolutionary fervor around him. And he begins to become political, even as his work is less really radical. He espouses the socialist and the anarchist position. And he does it because of someone he meets, someone whose work he reads, who he really admires, and who he ends up meeting, Proudhon. Proudhon was the theorist of anarcho-syndicalism, which, to put it very simply, is the idea that society can be changed if everyone controls, if people cooperatively run enterprises together and no longer work for other people. And it was actually something espoused by a lot of those artists, including actually Pissarro. Pissarro was a lifelong anarcho-syndicalist. But Proudhon was the theorist, and Courbet made his acquaintance, and then they decided to work together. And Courbet painted this painting, which we don't have in the original, because an enraged Catholic purchased it and destroyed it. It's a bunch of monks drunk out of their minds after a conference, kind of drunkenly and stumbling home. And it's his idea of a satire. It's actually, it's hard to tell from this, but it doesn't look like a very good painting. But it was done in partnership with Proudhon, except that very quickly Proudhon began to tire of his acquaintance, something Courbet never understood. Because after Proudhon's death, he does this magnificent portrait of Proudhon and his children based on a photograph. But it's a lovely portrait.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what Proudhon had to say to a friend about Courbet. He has the mind of a man of the world. Nevertheless, he is nothing but a painter. He can neither talk nor write. Classical studies have left few traces on him. Though he talks a great deal, his thoughts are disconnected. Yes, decidedly, he is stupid. This was a friend, but Courbet never understood that, because Courbet had puffed himself out in this sense of the great man, and a great man who was now embracing politics. And after Proudhon's death, he starts to assume Proudhon's role, which is highly disastrous. He continues painting, and some of them are quite good, and some of them are, he's always interested in water, he's interested in the source, and he links that often with femininity. And he does some good coastal paintings, a number of them with, in conjunction working with Whistler along the coast. This, I think, is one of my favorite. But there are others that are quite good. But at the same time, he's producing pieces like this, which was so scandalous it had to be hidden. There was a police report written about this painting. And it's a very competent painting, but it's kind of kitschy, in my opinion.
The crazy details.
Yeah.
Like
And painters, the other painters who admired his realism began to have real doubts about where he was going with his work when they saw a work like this, because he's catering to very, very wealthy people with a painting like this. People who are not so wealthy they can afford to pay a lot for this and then hide it somewhere. Another rather kitschy painting. And then this, which is an extremely good painting, but this was not ever seen by the public until 1988.
I think I've seen this painting somewhere.
Yeah. And he called it the source of the world.
I think I've seen that painting.
And at the same time, he knows that hunting paintings will sell always. He produces a whole bunch of them. I don't know, what are other people's reactions to this one?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either.
How's a cartoon feel?
Yeah, it has a
The outline is just like he outlines everything.
yeah, it's not got that rich, meaty quality of his earlier work.
Yeah.
It's very yeah, but also it's a cruel scene here.
Yeah.
You know?
Are they hunters? Is that?
They're hunters. They're hunters, but I mean, they're not. Curiously, they're letting the dogs kill this poor deer, buck, I should say.
The dogs are having a great time.
Yeah, they are, aren't they? And the trees are. I mean, this looks like something by Disney over here.
Looks like powdered sugar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, compared to what the Impressionists did with snow, not long after this. But he did some, as I said before, he did some nice coastal scenes. Some of them I quite like. And these he could all sell because of his name, you know. And he did any number of nudes, often relating this is called the source. This, I think, is quite good. And this one is a water spout that he apparently witnessed. And I think quite an interesting painting, though some of it is a little, he uses this kind of white that isn't that subtly handled, and it doesn't work very well for me. But the darker notes in this are really quite interesting. Okay. 1870, Napoleon III declares war on Prussia because they want to maintain the balance of power in Europe, and Prussia's getting too big for its britches. Prussia vanquishes the French in no time and captures Napoleon III. Napoleon III has to give away Alsace-Lorraine, and then he has to go to the French people. Well, actually, it's put before the French people. This is the peace that we have agreed to, and the Parisians feel left out because of the way the whole voting was done, and they rebel, and they take over Paris. The people take over Paris and declare a commune. And for 2 months, they hold the people of Paris hold Paris and declare their own communard government. And this is the moment at which Courbet, who's become more and more of a personality and more of a public radical figure, kind of steps on the stage. He manages to become the representative of the 6th arrondissement by claiming that he was active in the 1848 revolution, which is untrue. He was painting his brains out and he was just working on his own work. He had nothing to do with it. So he kind of exaggerates and lies. He gets the leadership position. Then they appoint him as the head of Minister of Art. Well, one of the things he had done previous to this is he hated this column that had been erected by, I believe, by Napoleon III, this massive column, and he several times suggested it be taken down. And during the time the Communards held Paris, they took it upon themselves. Come on. Why won't it go forward?
Click on the Acrobat or click on the photo again.
Ah,
there you go.
There's the column coming down, this massive, and looks like pretty ugly column, actually. So they took it down. There's the statue on the ground. The people who took it down are posing with it. But a few weeks later, the French army manages to seize Paris and take it back. The communards are rounded up. Something between 10,000 and 40,000 ordinary Parisians who were considered communards, though often on not very much evidence, were rounded up and slaughtered by the French army. So in a sense, Courbet was very lucky. He was thrown in jail, but it was a gentleman's jail where he could order meals every night and have them sent to him. And he had oil paints to paint still lifes. Spent 6 months in the jail. And during that time, the government decided they were going to bill him to rebuild the column. And meanwhile, he leaves Paris and goes back to Ornans. But then he learns that they're gonna come after him because they want him to, be available to pay the debt that they're gonna lay on his shoulders. And he flees across the border into Switzerland. And he paints, in the beginning, he paints some fairly good paintings. This is sort of a commentary on his situation. That's how he feels. this is done actually in the early days of his time in Switzerland, but is a memory of Ornan. You see, he's a person who really was attached to his home and his town and his entire support network there. And all of a sudden he's in exile and he can't paint any of the things. So what he starts to do is paint copies and variations of things he already painted. Then he hires 3 other artists to do paintings where he directs them, but he does almost nothing on the paintings, but he signs them because he has this huge public that wants his paintings. And this painting, to me, I doubt very much that he touched this painting. It has his signature on it. Meanwhile, he's drinking more and more heavily, and at the age of 58, he dies of cirrhosis of the liver. And Manet, who, you know, for a while, Manet and his friends really admired Courbet, but he finally says, well, he says actually after the trial, he said, he behaved like a coward in front of the tribunal and is no longer worthy of any interest. It's kind of, you know, to me, it's a very tragic story. But finally, in slightly better days, he visited Monet while Monet was painting his Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which ended up being cut up in little pieces because it was so badly damaged during storage. But here is Courbet.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually Monet's first wife. And Basile, his good friend Basile, who would die. He might well have died in the Franco-Prussian War, actually, I think. Very young.